Hello, I'm Professor Fred Long, and I'd like to welcome you to Koine Greek Grammar. Right now we're going to be looking at Chapter 5, which will introduce nouns of the second or O class declension. We'll look at the masculine and neuter article endings. We'll be introduced to the concept of predicate nominatives. We'll look at two verbs that take them. We'll look at a few more proper nouns, the name of Jesus. We'll look at vocatives as thematic address and apposition, and we'll conclude by looking at New Testament Greek critical additions and their punctuation. But first, let's start with the vocabulary. At the front of them, you'll see the article, and that article will indicate their gender. There is one feminine second declension noun presented here and in the textbook. O angelus, O adelphos, O anthropos, O apostolos, O didaskalos, O theos, O Jesus, O cosmos, O kurios, O logos, O nomos, O uranos, O huios, O Christos. And then we have the article, the complete forms, masculine, feminine, and neuter would be o, a, to. Then we have three neuter declension nouns, to daimonion, to evangelion, and to teknon. The feminine noun is a odos, and the special verb that takes a predicate nominative is imi, imi. Well, let's look at the nouns of the second or O class declension. These declensions are groupings of nouns, and this declension is known for the use of omicron or omegas in their endings. They are comprised of masculine and neuter stems. And so the endings you can see listed here, os, u, o, on, e, on, is, us. The neuter will use the same endings for the genitive and datives. And so that's a pattern that you need to look at. Also, you'll notice that the nominative and accusative form for the neuter is always the same for the singular or for the plural. So basically you have the same endings except for the nominative and accusative, which then happens to be the same. On, u, o, on, a, on, is, a. So these endings we will see are very similar to the article endings of the second declension. You're going to see these endings a lot, and you need to memorize them. Here are the masculine and neuter article endings. O, tu, to, tone, we, tone, tuis, tus. For the neuter, to, to, ta, tone, tis, ta. These forms you will see a lot, so memorize these endings. Remember that the article occurs about 18% of the time in the total of the Greek New Testament. So you will see the feminine forms and these masculine and neuter forms in virtually every sentence. So there's a checkpoint. Be sure that you try the checkpoints out. And let's talk about verbs that take the predicate nominative. Verbs of being will equate two nouns with one another. You'll have a subject, and then you'll have what's called a predicate nominative. Now, normally when we've been looking at verbs, you've learned that the subject is the nominative case, and then you'll have a verb, and then the direct object will be in the accusative case. John hit the ball. The ball would be in the accusative case. Well, with equative verbs like imi and gnome, the subject is being equated with another noun, and that other noun is going to be found in the nominative case, and they're called the predicate nominative. The word predicate has to do with the verb and the verbal assertion being made, and so that's why the term predicate is used. So these verbs, imi and yenome, when you see them, they will often have a predicate nominative, that is, the noun that the subject is being equated with. So it's a little bit tricky because you might think it should be accusative, but because the verbs are equating two nouns together, the subject case will be used again for the predicate nominative. So these equative verbs will use a subject nominative and then also be found with a predicate nominative. Now, how can you tell which one is the subject and which one is the predicate nominative? Well, sometimes you can't. If they both have the article, then you cannot tell which one is the subject and which one is the predicate nominative. But the one that has the noun or substantive is another word for a noun, the one that has the article, it will be the subject, and the one without the article will be the predicate nominative. Let's look at the forms of imi. This is a very common verb because it's a verb of being. It's used to define things. It's used to identify things, and because of that, it's important. Imi, estin, esmen, este, isin. So I am, you are, he, she, it is, we are, you are, they are. So that's predicate nominatives. The verb imi, we'll take them. Look at the different examples provided in the textbook. Let's look at proper nouns in 5.4. We have talked about how non-Greek names may be non-declinable. That is, they're not going to show Greek endings, but they may have an article, and that article will help identify how they're functioning in the sentence. Here is the name of Jesus, and you'll see this name a fair amount. It is a Hebrew word that's come into the Greek language, and it shows some endings, but a little bit different than you're used to. Something also tricky about Jesus' name is that the genitive and the dative form are identical, Jesu. And so the only way that you can tell the difference between them is through context and, if present, the article. Now, vocatives, as we have seen, indicate direct address. Now, you're not learning the endings for the vocatives because in the Greek New Testament, they'll be set off by commas, and that'll make them fairly obvious. One thing that can be added to vocatives is the interjection o. And this interjection will increase the intensity of emotion expressed, and it may be negative or positive. So when you see this, look for extra significance or emotion being expressed. Some of the purposes of direct address or the vocative is that they can be used to signal a change of address. So they will occur at the beginning of a sentence to indicate a different focus, and that's important to notice. They also provide thematic address. That is, they may serve to characterize the addressees based upon how the speaker conceives of them. One real notable example of this is in 2 Corinthians, where Paul will identify them as Corinthians right before he confronts their idolatry. And so I think that's very significant for him to identify them by their regional name. Thematic address vocatives are also forward-pointing devices. They create a break in the discourse just before something surprising or important. Vocatives can also signify the beginning of a new unit. So pay attention to vocatives. In our marking method, since they're a special use of the cases, we use curly braces to indicate them. Now, apposition is something that is fairly common in Greek. Apposition is the abutting of a noun after another noun. So that second noun will be right next to and follow the first noun, and it qualifies and defines the first noun. They're abutted. This is called apposition. It's very common. And the significance of apposition is that often the appositive, the noun that follows the first noun, or the substantive that follows the first noun, is giving more important description of that first noun. And that further description is usually important contextually for interpretation. Vocatives, or direct addresses, when they're given in a positive, that the appositive will normally be a nominative that is articular, that is, that has an article. So here's some examples. For constituent marking of appositives, I use an equal sign. So when you're marking up a sentence, when you're looking at a sentence and you see something that looks like it's an appositive, that is, a noun abutted behind another noun further explaining it, use an equal sign, and that'll help you to translate the sentence. One of the last things to look at in this chapter are different New Testament Greek critical editions and their conventions of punctuation. This can be a little bit confusing for students. Remember that the Greek New Testament, the modern punctuation was added later. And so there are different punctuations. Originally, texts were written in capital letters. Sometimes they might show some spacing between words. And sometimes at the end of a line, you might have a bit of a gap because a word is wrapping. So some of the standard editions of the Greek New Testament are the Nestle-Aland text, named after the editors, and then the United Bible Society, or the UBS text, which actually is in its 5th edition currently. These two editions, the Nestle-Aland and the UBS, have the same Greek in their text, but they will follow different punctuation conventions, just slightly different. A couple other texts that you may encounter is the Free Society of Biblical Literature Greek New Testament text, and then there's the Byzantine or majority text. The SBL text was created by Michael Holmes, going through and sorting through textual variants. And the benefit of this text is that it's free for non-commercial use, and even if you use it commercially, you just have to ask for permission. Well, the punctuation conventions, again, period equals period, comma equals comma, semicolon will represent a question mark in English. A raised dot will correspond either to a colon or semicolon. And parentheses in the Greek text will indicate parentheses in English. Now, the UBS text will also capitalize the first letters at the beginning of a quotation. For the Nestle-Aland text, the NA text, there won't be any capitalization. And so you'll just have to rely on context to understand when the quotation begins. Well, actually, there's sometimes debate about when a quotation begins and sometimes where it ends. An example of this would be John 3:16. We're not sure if that's Jesus speaking or John the narrator speaking. Although I think if you look in your red letter Bible, you'll see that they decide that it's Jesus speaking. Oftentimes it's stated very emphatically that the original text had no spaces and all the words ran together. Well, that's not entirely true. In some of our earliest manuscripts, for example, Papyrus 46, which is debated when it's dated, but clearly in the 2nd century, possibly early 2nd century, it does show some gapping between words. So there is some awareness of breaks between words at times, that there was some understanding of word divisions, even though the characters may run together. Occasionally you can see some spacing. Now, some other marks that you will see in the text include brackets. Now, brackets in a Greek critical edition will indicate some words or phrases or verses that are questionable. In other words, the manuscript tradition has variant readings that are difficult to decide upon in that case. The editors believe that the words there were probably a part of the original manuscript, but there's some doubt that remains. So that's what brackets will indicate inside the Greek text. You might also see bold or italics, and these will be used to indicate Old Testament quotations. We've talked about capitalization, the difference between the Nestle Aland and the SBL or the UBS. If you want to see the differences in conventions, I have 2 Corinthians 9, 8 through 9, and it's worth studying how differently these texts, these Greek testaments, provide punctuation and boldness, or italics. You can see the difference there between Old Testament quotation and the UBS text versus the use of italics. You can also see in the Society of Biblical Literature Greek New Testament that the editor, Michael Holmes, has decided to put this in parentheses, this just as part. So there's differences between his text and the other texts on this point. Well, that about wraps it up for this chapter. Be sure to see the case in point, which looks at an example of predicate nominatives in John chapter 1.